Hey guys, this is for February 26th, which is a Wednesday. We have class period 2. I kind of asked you guys what you wanted. Um, some of you said you wanted to have another video, which I am perfectly fine with. So yeah, here it is. Um, we will be finishing chapter 32 today, which means that I would like to see your notes. That'll be what today's assignment is for you to submit your notes to me. So yeah, make sure that you get that done. We only have one more chapter after this, and it actually, I think, will only take one day, which means that we are getting close to kind of finishing content, which is great, which means that we can finish content prior to you doing your mocks. So yeah, that's obviously the goal for us, is to finish that before your mocks. So what we'll do is we'll start to look at things to do during okay, sorry, I had paused it for a second. So yeah, what we're going to start to look at is, normally what we would do is we do a lot of different past papers and do revision based on the past papers. Obviously, we can't really do that. I can give you some past papers, but it's hard to mark them and then get feedback and stuff. What we could also do is we could look at some topics that you'd like to revise. So you could send me a couple topics that you'd like to revise, and we could go through that. We could also I could do some topics that tend to show up on your mocks. I don't know what's on your mocks because I haven't set that work yet. I'll have to set it once we go back. So I don't know what I'm going to pick. I have to look at all my spreadsheets and determine what I should pick, and I don't know that yet. But what I can do is I can give you some help on what shows up very commonly on assessments. I think I was talking to Kathy a little bit about this, about things that you can revise for your mocks, and just in general, things like what key terms should you focus on, what diagrams should you focus on, things like that. So we could do a little bit of that as well, maybe towards the beginning of next week. Okay, so I'll share my screen with you, and we can get started. Okay, so we've been on 32, which is aid. We went through this stuff last class or last video about types of aid, so you should already have all that. So what we're really going to be doing here, and again, it's not massively, sorry, I'm sitting on the floor. You can see the doorknob. So it's not massively difficult. So yeah, we'll just go through it. Really what we're going to be doing is evaluating aid. So like if you were to see a question about aid, most likely in part D of paper 2, then what would you need to talk about? And that's kind of where we're going through. So this is parts of some of the evaluation aspects of aid. So aid, if we go back to our definition up here, aid is assistance that is given to a country that would not have been provided in normal markets. So it's some sort of assistance. So we talked about humanitarian aid, we talked about grant aid, things like food and medicine. We talked about developmental aid, so things that help an economy develop, things like project aid or technical aid or commodity aid, all key terms you should be familiar with. So if we're giving this aid, how do we evaluate it? Should it be done? And one of the arguments against it is that aid doesn't lead to a country improving. It just makes them dependent on it. So think about if your parents consistently give you money all the time, you're going to expect them to continue to give that money. So it's difficult for them, once you're given something, for it to be taken away. And that's the same thing that happens with aid, is once a country gets aid, it becomes difficult to take it away. So we're going to kind of go through some of the issues with aid. It doesn't help a country grow. Um, it can be very much linked to like corruption and bribery, because if it's not accounted for correctly, then it could just disappear. And there's lots of examples of that. I could probably share some videos with you about that as well. If someone's giving you aid, then sometimes you feel that you must help them in some way, and that might not always be the best thing for you to do. So the US does this actually a lot. They'll give aid to one country with the hope that that country will then come back and support them. And that might not always be in the country's best interest. Um, Sometimes aid can lead to lack of innovation, because if a country is relying on aid to help them, then they might not be creative and come up with new solutions to help themselves. It's a very economic way of looking at it. Um, And then sometimes people will say, we'll give you this aid, but you must do something. You must allow us to take something from you or give us something. And that can sometimes be really negative for the developing country. So they might say, the US might say, we'll give you aid, but you need to allow us to come in and take resources. Or you must allow us to trade with you freely without putting any barriers in it, which could hurt domestic industry. So there's lots of things that could happen with aid, um, on the negative side. But obviously, this is you have to evaluate it. So we talk about negatives or concerns about aid, but there's also lots of positives as well. So a lot of aid is going to come through what are called NGOs, or non-governmental organizations. They're very different. They're all over the place. There's NGOs that do so many different things. Because of MUN, you guys are probably familiar with the idea of an NGO. But usually NGOs their goal is to provide some sort of economic help or humanitarian help, or promote things like sustainable development. So a lot of NGOs will focus on the Millennium Development Goals, or now the Sustainable Development Goals. And usually NGOs are very targeted, and they focus on very specific things. So whereas the UN is very broad and looks at lots of different things, NGOs tend to focus on very specific things, and they can really focus on those particular things. So they might focus on things like poverty, or workers' rights, or human rights, or the environment. There's lots of different things that they could focus on. Um, the one problem with NGOs is a lot of times they don't have a lot of power, and that they can't sometimes it's difficult for them to get things done. There are NGOs all over the world. There are even some in China. You can see here, 2013, there was a little over 500,000 NGOs in China. So that's obviously a lot. So they're all over the place. Some of them you'll be really familiar with, and then some of them you won't be familiar with at all. There have been questions. There's been a question on a past paper that said a list, like I think it was list 2 NGOs. It was in part A of a paper 2. So you just had to list 2, and you had to come up with 2 ones that people knew about. So one of the ones that you might be very familiar with is what's called the World Wildlife Fund, or WWF. So we're going to watch a video about the World Wildlife Fund, if you're not familiar with it, just so you have an idea of a couple different, and at least one NGO. Another one that we talked about previously is the Red Cross. So if you're ever asked to name NGOs, you could talk about World Wildlife Fund, and you could talk about the Red Cross. Probably some of the 2 biggest NGOs that you could talk about. So watch this real quick.
I am protecting life on our planet.
Day by day, with every single thing I do.
I conserve the world's biggest forests.
I safeguard the rivers
and oceans.
I stand up for coral reefs, rainforests,
Hundreds.
deserts, and grasslands. I work with communities in the Amazon, Arctic,
the Congo,
and the Himalayas.
I collaborate with the biggest companies on earth.
to make their processes and their products more sustainable.
I influence governments,
create policy that recognizes and respects,
the importance of nature.
Give a voice to all animals who call Earth their home.
I'm protecting life on our planet. But because I'm with WWF, I am not doing it alone. 6,000 staff.
6 million members,
In over 100 countries.
For more than half a century.
businesses, foundations,
Governments, communities,
Individuals.
and one iconic panda,
Together,
We are protecting life on our planet.
Including our own.
together,
anything is possible.
Okay, so obviously WWF, you've probably seen this logo before. You've probably maybe heard of it. Maybe what we could do is obviously there's NGOs all over the place. There's some you probably are really big. What I maybe ask is if you're on YouTube and watching this, you could comment a couple NGOs that you know of down in the comments, just so people can see what different NGOs are out there. Just in case they need to reference an NGO on their paper, they have a couple that you could talk about. So maybe list one or two in the comments that you're familiar with. Okay. So going back to aid and problems with aid, one problem is that aid sometimes is given and doesn't need to be paid back. So like some sort of gift aid or humanitarian aid. A lot of this time, this aid is not needed to be paid back. But sometimes aid is given and it does need to be paid back. We talked about that up here. Let's see if we can find it real quick. See where we have it here. Like here, long-term loans, what are called soft loans. Sometimes these can become problems for countries because they'll accept the aid and know that they have to pay it back, but then eventually they get to a position where they can't pay it back. And then they're put in a position where they're unable to pay back a loan, and then they have to pay some sort of penalty. They could lose land, they could lose resources, their debt could get bigger. There's lots of different problems that could come with accepting too much aid that eventually has to be paid back. And this was a very big problem going into the 1970s and 1980s, where countries were borrowing tons of money and then they weren't paying it back, and it created this huge debt problem in the world. And it actually led to a massive global recession because so many countries were unable to pay back their debt that they then had to put in all this contractionary fiscal policy so that they could pay their debts, and then their economy went into contraction. And if enough economies go into contraction at the same time, then it results in this global issue. So that's what happened in the 1970s and 1980s. And as a result, there were these new rules put in place to kind of stop this type of aid that puts countries in positions where they're eventually going to have to pay back debt that they're never going to be able to afford. So what the IMF did, the International Monetary Fund did, was they put in procedures to help make sure that this type of stuff doesn't happen again. Excuse me. So these are some things that they did to make sure that countries would be able to not just take on debt that they wouldn't be able to pay back. So they are encouraging trade liberalization, something we talked about previously, opening up those markets. Encourage countries to export things that they can make money on. They encouraged controls on currencies. They encouraged foreign direct investment, so opening up to that economy. They encouraged governments to give up control of industries and give it to private companies. They encourage governments to control what they're spending on. They encourage governments to protect in their citizens through social expenditure. So making sure that you provide education, you provide healthcare, you provide basic services. You open up the market as much as possible, and you you try to get rid of as much corruption as possible. So what the IMF was doing was saying that if we can liberalize the economy, then we won't have as many issues as before. But we found, discussing previously, that the Washington consensus and trade liberalization doesn't always work, because we also have a Beijing model that could also work as well. So is this the best way to ensure that indebtedness won't happen by opening up a country? Well, maybe, depending on if you need to protect domestic industries. Well, if you need to protect domestic industries, then some of this stuff won't work. So it's definitely a balancing act. If you're a little confused at what I'm talking about, maybe go back to one of my videos where I talked about trade liberalization, and that might help you remember some of the stuff I'm talking about. Okay, we won't do that. So this is just kind of summing up some of the stuff I've talked about. So these structural changes that the IMF put in place. So what did it do? Well, it helped with inflation and improved less developed countries. It got rid of deficits. It moved public companies into private hands, which is a good thing. It helped move countries away from a fixed currency to more of a free or managed floating currencies. But the problem is that there's still a lot of inequality. So some of the negatives are that there's still a lot of inequality. There still is unemployment. Wages are very flat. The wages aren't going up as much as they should. And if governments aren't able to tax and tariff, then they can't collect revenue. And if they can't collect revenue, then they can't provide services. So if you use expansionary fiscal policy and you remove taxes, then you're not able to use expansionary policies to put in spending, because you don't have any money. So if you cut taxes to encourage growth within the economy, that's great. But then how are you going to pay for services like healthcare and education and improving infrastructure? How do you pay for that? So it's very much a balancing act. You can't just get rid of everything, because you need it. You need taxes. And that's where the evaluation comes in, right? That's where the evaluation of this stuff comes in. All right. So that's actually where we'll stop. Hopefully you're able to get the notes. Once you get the notes, please send them to me. And then also, like I was asking earlier, if you could comment on below the video about some different NGOs that you're familiar with, it'll help everyone out. Okay. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. I appreciate those of you that have met with me about your IAs. If you need anything, shoot me an email or leave a comment. I hope you guys are doing well, and I will talk to you later.